right, let's get started. And I have packed this presentation with some GIFs, so hopefully the animations will help you stay awake if the content does not. But WOTUS whiplash. If any of you guys are keeping count, WOTUS, or Waters of the U.S., it has gone through rule writing changes 3 times in the last 7 years. So there is a ton of back and forth and kind of political puppetry that WOTUS has been bearing the burden of. But before we jump in, I want to talk a little bit about the origin story and the history. Court cases and precedent and other guidance that have kind of hemmed in WOTUS throughout the years. And what WOTUS and Texas Water Code have in common and where they're disparate or where they're different. And then also we're going to take out the crystal ball and look a little bit into the future and see what WOTUS might have in store for us tomorrow. All right, so the picture here, I'm not sure if you guys recognize it, but this is really what kind of started the modern day environmental movement, is the Cuyahoga River on fire. It is not the picture from 1969, which was really the last gasp and apparently the 3rd or 4th time the river caught on fire. There were no pictures of actually the 69 fire because it was extinguished quite quickly, but again, the fact that the river had caught on fire, was burning 3 different times at least, really galvanized the community, galvanized the state and the United States to address its growing issue with pollution and water. And so Nixon signed actually he made some major amendments to the Pollution Control Act of 1948 in 1972, which then became the Clean Water Act, and really what we know today and what creates the jurisdictional waters. So where the EPA and the Corps of Engineers step in, Army Corps of Engineers step in and provide permitting to maintain really our pristine waters that we have. And so it is an auspicious year this year. The Clean Water Act turns 50 on October 18th, so a big round of applause for the Clean Water Act. But again, what it did was it required a permit to discharge point source solution into waters of the state. And it said, EPA and Corps, you defined what a WOTUS is. You tell us what waters of the state is. And, so EPA and Corps said, okay, we'll get to work on that. And guidance in court cases. So in 1977, so that's 5 years-ish after the Clean Water Act came into effect, the Corps and EPA decided that adjacent wetlands, those are WOTUS. Those aren't traditionally navigable. But we're going to go ahead and roll that into WOTUS and understand those waters as jurisdictional. So that is one of the first pieces to remember. 1977 added adjacent wetlands, and they in fact rejected the notion that only navigable or navigable waters are WOTUS. So 1985, with the Food Securities Act, there was an attempt to disincentivize the movement of marshlands, wetlands into croplands. And so what the FSA did is say, okay, well, we'll give financial incentives to those folks that are farming and working the land, but not those folks that convert the land from marshland or wetlands after 1985. That gave us a bright line where we could say, okay, prior converted cropland in WOTUS is exempt if it's before 1985. So that's where we get the PCC in WOTUS, that exemption. And 86, we see the migratory bird rule come into effect. And this one was pretty controversial, and this one greatly expanded what was considered a WOTUS and looked at intrastate wetlands, marshlands, essentially anywhere a migratory bird could land was considered a WOTUS. And so again, that great expansion kind of brought about the opening up in the late 80s of WOTUS. And now, WOTUS and SCOTUS, this is really where the drama starts and the drama begins. So we have Riverside Bayview, And that court case decided in '85 essentially said that, all right, isolated wetlands, you guys are going to be part of WOTUS. So it doesn't have to be a wetland adjacent to, it can be an intrastate isolated wetland abutting, say, a canal or a man-made feature. That can be part of a WOTUS, all right? And then they acknowledged that, hey, this is getting really tricky. There's a lot of gray area. It's hard to understand where water stops and land starts, but we're going to make the attempt. So that's what Riverside Bayview did. Now, Swank in 2001 essentially reversed the migratory bird rule, okay? And so what that court ruling said is, hey, you cannot use a migratory bird flying across state lines to invoke the Commerce Clause to call water a WOTUS. And so Swank 2001, again, reversed the migratory bird rule. We no longer had that as the primary evidence of what was a WOTUS. Now, Rapanos in 2006, that's where we get the term significant nexus. Have y'all heard of that term, or, it's come up? Okay, great. So Rapanos is really where the rubber meets the road on this and where the drama sets in, and what we've been arguing around ever since, in fact. So one of the key pieces of that is that SCOTUS case was a plurality, so it was a 4-1-4 vote, so there was no clear majority. And so Scalia said, okay, wetlands, adjacent wetlands, yes, that's a WOTUS, but there needs to be permanent flow, so most of the year flow needs to happen, and the water bodies need to touch. Okay, so you can't have a water body that's separated by 200 feet, 300 feet, 500 feet, and a man-made feature. That's just not a WOTUS. And Kennedy said, well, I agree, Scalia, with how you're voting in the case, but not with the test that you're proposing. So that's where the one vote came in. So he said, what I think a WOTUS is a significant nexus. So anytime one water body is close to another water body and changing one of the water bodies significantly impacts the other, then that's a significant nexus test. That's the test we apply to a WOTUS, and that's what we understand as jurisdictional under waters of the United States. So because there was no clear majority, the EPA and the Corps were allowed to pick the parameters dictated by 5 or more justices. So the EPA and the Corps said, okay, Scalia and Kennedy, you're both right. We picked both. And so that's where we are today, or that's where we were. And again, that has brought about kind of a case-by-case basis understanding in certain circumstances, which again has brought on significant litigation and court cases. All right, so this picture here, beautiful beach, sunset. This may or may not be Maui, but this is what I found when I Googled Maui. So now we get to the Maui case. And it's always interesting when we see water and clean water issues in the Supreme Court. I always kind of perk up a little bit and take notice and see what's going on. And so this one had been going around and around, making its way through different circuits. And essentially, City of Maui Maui Municipality, publicly owned treatment work, was discharging its wastewater underground and essentially discharging that into groundwater. And in all definitions of WOTUS at the time of Maui, groundwater was not jurisdictional. Hands off groundwater, it's not jurisdictional. But what the Maui case brought us is an understanding of a functional equivalent. So when groundwater, in fact, acts as the conduit, taking that wastewater into what is known as a WOTUS, so in this case, it quickly moved the wastewater into the territorial seas. And by quickly, I mean it happened in, a week or less. So it was a conduit. They did a dye test. And so then SCOTUS was kind of hands tied and said, well, you're discharging into this. We're not regulating this body of water. We're not regulating groundwater. But if it acts as the conduit, then you do need a permit, because ultimately your waste is making its way quite quickly into that territorial sea. And so next steps on this is, does the functional equivalent or idea of functional equivalent become the new significant nexus? Is it the next thing that we're talking about for another 2 decades? Again, functional equivalent will need to go through rulemaking. We'll need to understand exactly what that term means. And implications, yes, the conduit theory is alive and well. Okay, so now moving into Obama-era WOTUS. Until Obama-era WOTUS, everything was really hemmed in by Supreme Court rulings and guidance. Okay, we didn't have a major effort to go into rule writing for waters of the U.S. We had some changes in the preamble. We had some Supreme Court rulings. We had parameters, but Obama era really went into the formal rulemaking and went through the process, and what popped out was a WOTUS that brought in 3% more water under jurisdiction than we previously saw. So about 3%. And what that represented, we used the significant nexus test, and that brought in some additional water. And we used an idea of ephemeral streams, and ephemeral waters. So waters that were only there some of the time instead of the majority of a year. And so again, that roped in 3%, about 3% more water into WOTUS. And there were 3 categories. The jurisdictional by rule, so navigable waters, tributaries, rivers, streams, oceans, territorial seas, all the stuff we typically saw. The significant nexus test, again, adjacent land, so adjacent waters, and we brought in a new term, neighboring waters, and those excluded by rule. Now, the significant nexus test, the significant nexus test has a bright line and different ways to interpret what a significant nexus is. I'm not going to go into all of that because that gets pretty nitty-gritty, but that was laid out in the WOTUS. So now, importantly, exclusions. So what was excluded? Prior converted cropland. So again, that 1985 Food Security Act that gave us prior converted cropland. Groundwater. Always has been excluded, was explicitly excluded here. Stormwater control features, wastewater treatment plants, and a few other things. So immediately lawsuits commenced. There were roughly the same number of states that adopted the Obama-era WOTUS as a number of states that rejected it and went through court cases. So we had a patchwork of WOTUS for about 2 years. And then the Trump-era WOTUS, or also called the Navigable Waters Rule. So the Trump-era WOTUS restored the surface water connection. So again, that old Scalia test, the surface water connection test, and removed the significant nexus test. And so exclusions. Exclusions under Trump-era WOTUS look a lot like the exclusions under Obama-era WOTUS, in fact. And shockingly, these 2 WOTUSes did have a lot of similarities. But once again, lawsuits commenced, we went back and forth, and now we come into Biden-era WOTUS. And Biden said, hey, we couldn't figure it out with Obama, we couldn't figure it out with Trump in a way that everyone came together and said, yes, we can get behind this WOTUS. So what are we gonna do? We're gonna revert back to pre-1986 WOTUS, just go back to the basics, right? What did we have then? And then how do we interpret that WOTUS in light of the Supreme Court rulings? And so Biden dropped key exclusions for stormwater control features and groundwater, because while those were not explicitly stated in the 1986 WOTUS, they were understood. They're understood in the way WOTUS played out, the interpretation of it, but it wasn't specifically written into the rule. And so Biden said, well, we're going back to what we liked. So we're taking all of those exclusions out. And in fact, he only brought in 2 exclusions: prior converted crop area, so the PCC, and wastewater treatment plants and all of the ponds, lagoons, pipes, et cetera, conveyance systems that go into wastewater treatment plants. So Biden said, to heck with all this stuff we can't agree about, taking out all those exclusions. We know that groundwater is not a navigable water. We've had a Supreme Court ruling that said this is not jurisdictional, but we have a functional equivalent piece to it. So we're just going with what we know. So interestingly, it seems as if Biden's era WOTUS, in an attempt to really get back to the basics and back to what we know, muddied the waters. I was wondering yeah. Okay. Morgan McKinley, in fact, is his real name. So once again, in an attempt to bring clarity, he essentially, in many communities, sought confusion, right? Sowed confusion because, the question always remains, if the exemptions were removed, why are they removed? But once again, leaning on Supreme Court precedent and leaning on how WOTUS has been interpreted and the fact that WOTUS harkens back to navigable waters, we know that groundwater, stormwater control features, all of that is not going to be included in a WOTUS. So what did they say about the WOTUS? Well, about Biden's WOTUS is that it restores and maintains the chemical and physical and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And again, that harkens back to original Clean Water Act language. So for this crowd, WOTUS and groundwater, here we go again. Once again, in the preamble of Biden's WOTUS, which is not, in fact, rule or law right now, right? So we just got through the public comment period, which ended in February of 2022 for Biden's WOTUS. So lots of comments were made, lots of thoughts bandied about. A lot of people had WOTUS fatigue and WOTUS whiplash, and so it didn't make as much of a splash as a lot of other WOTUSs did, specifically Obama's and Trump's. But, WOTUS and groundwater. The preamble of Biden's WOTUS noted the Maui case and specifically said, groundwater is not a WOTUS. We've talked about this, we've looked at it, we will not include it. But what's bizarre is that that's included in the preamble, but not a specific called out exclusion. So the preamble, we can understand, is definitive. And so the preamble says this is what it's all about, this is what we want to say, this is how we're going to say it. But the actual rule neglected to include that exclusion. But they neglected to include 15 other exclusions as well that were found in other rules. So, now, with regard to WOTUS and Texas water code or Texas law, let's take a look here. TPDES, TLAP, and Chapter 26, oh my. So TPDES is the Texas issuing of the NPDES permits, right? So TCEQ received delegation in 1998 to issue these permits on behalf of EPA in Texas for point source discharges into a WOTUS or into waters of the state. And so what we have to do, since, national WOTUS is what we look up to, but we have our own rules here in the state of Texas that we need to follow. What we need to look at is Texas Water Code. And Texas Water Code says permits are issued for waters discharging into the waters of the state or adjacent to. So guys, the punchline here is that Texas Water Code goes way beyond federal water code and mandate, and in fact, arguably, is much, much broader in what is considered a WOTUS. And why is that? Well, a number of reasons. One of them is that we have TLAPs, which are Texas land application permits, which are fantastic permits, in fact, but they're usually kind of in the hill country area, Highland Lakes region, and comply with a moratorium on discharges into Highland Lakes. And essentially, they allow wastewater treatment plants to land apply. And so looking at groundwater and waters of the state. So what does Texas specifically say about groundwater? Well, groundwater in Texas is considered a water of the state, in fact. So once again, arguably, Texas water code and Texas law is much broader and brings groundwater in, whereas we're looking at WOTUS and, you know, thinking about, oh my gosh, what is this going to do to us? Materially, it shouldn't do a whole lot either way, because what you have now is what you're going to have after a different WOTUS pops out. And so just another few key quotes, in fact, from Texas Water Code. And now, looking at the crystal ball, right? So what are we looking forward to in the future? Well, so October 3rd, 2022, so in just a month or so, we're going to hear oral arguments in a Sackett case, and so at the Supreme Court. And so this is the opening day of the Supreme Court session, and they're going to hear a Clean Water Act case, in fact. So I'm all jazzed. I hope you guys are too. But this is, I guess, the second or third time Sackett's been in front of the Supreme Court, second, I believe. So they're going to hear it. They're going to issue a ruling in summer of 2022. And so what does that do to Biden's WOTUS timeline? Well, again, I said comments were due for that WOTUS that is out on the table right now. Those have already been due. The EPA is just, in fact, in a holding pattern, and they're going to wait and see what the Supreme Court says and roll any of that Supreme Court ruling and awareness into their WOTUS. So the rules on WOTUS that we saw and that we commented on in February might change if the Sackett ruling significantly changes interpretation and understanding of WOTUS. So that's what the crystal ball says. And if I had another picture of Morgan McKinley, I'd throw it up there, but I don't. And any thoughts, questions, heckling? Oh, I thought I was going to get away without any questions. Okay.
And this may be the fire and the flame or whatever you want to call it. My understanding in my readings were, I do this a little bit of small-time farming and ranching, that under the Obama administration of WOTUS, that it was any water that ran off of your land for any reason was going to come under that law. And, you know, myself, if I fertilize my grasses and then it rains on it and the fertilizer runs into the streams, then that was going to come under government control of my land. Am I wrong in my reading?
I wish I could answer that definitively. What I will say is that in your reading, if you do your farming in Texas, you're under TPDES, you're under Texas water law, because the state has primacy, the state has delegation. When you would come under a federal WOTUS is if you were doing a dredge and fill, which is a 404 permit through the Corps of Engineers. So if you said, I want to build a house on this marshland, I just want to throw a bunch of rocks, bricks, cement in it and change this wetland into my foundation. That's when federal WOTUS would impact you. But with your farmland, again, you were under Texas state law with that. And if Texas says you don't need a permit, you don't need a permit. Yeah, I know that's kind of a controversial answer and it's not definitive, but that's where we are right now.
I think that last point you made about Texas law going further than WOTUS probably surprised a lot of people in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, with TLAPs, with Texas land application, so, Lakeway Mud, for example, those organizations that land apply, in Texas state law, there needs to be an understanding of how we discharge to both water and land adjacent to water, because we land apply our discharge here too. Anyway, it's an interesting twist, and again, materially, it's why many folks in Texas and many of my members on the clean water side think, all right, well, I got to keep an eye on this, but what I am under right now, the constructs that I'm under right now, are generally broader than what you guys are thinking about in Washington.